First up, we have Enter the Gungeon, a top-down roguelike, RNG-based procedurally generated shooter. It's based on iframes and dodge roll mechanics that will allow the player to move through a bullet hell-like situation with a little bit of flexibility. You'll see in an example room, this is the first floor, so obviously the skill curve is at its lowest. Usually you can circle strafe. You'll see a dodge roll right there as I roll through a bullet with those iframes. There are some problems with the procedural generation, as you'll see in this room. I literally just sit here and shoot. There's nothing really compelling about it. There's a bullet sponge problem, I should say. The iframes can be a little unforgiving, and that's good for replayability and mastering a skill cap. So, as you can see, if you catch yourself towards the end of the roll still in bullets, you're going to get hit. There's random loot, which can vary your power level on runs by a significant margin. The quality of chests are different, and the items you get and how good any given item in a tier is also going to be different. So it does, again, play more into the replayability emphasis that most roguelikes have. The most difficult aspects of these games are always going to be the boss fights, especially in terms of Gungeon, where it turns into a more bullet hell focused sort of escapade as you try and perfect the bosses. Low health turnouts result in it being a big problem if you manage to get yourself hit. As the game progresses, the bullets are going to be more prevalent on the screen, and it's going to be harder to avoid taking damage. Sometimes, however, there are problems. As you can see in this clip with the Gatling Gold boss, I can just make him shoot into a wall and it completely nullifies all of his attacks, which sort of trivializes the whole boss fight. So you can really cheese hard if you get in the right rooms, which is sort of a problem with the procedural generation. Overall, I think this game is a lot of fun. It's well made. There's RNG issues. Sometimes you can end up being a little bit too underpowered. Sometimes you can be a little bit overpowered. And some of the rooms are non-functional in the way that you deal with bosses. So this room, for example, is significantly easier than others with the Gatling Gun because there's static cover that doesn't get destroyed. So you can cheese it. Overall, Gungeon, excellent game. Very enjoyable. And we'll move on for our next clip. And next on the list is Shovel Knight, Spectre of Torrent, a 2D platformer based off the Mega Man era. And I will be doing the playthrough with Spectre Knight, who has a wall run and dash mechanic that is central to his kit and moving through levels. You'll see from the start this dash mechanic where I can attack enemies and it will give me momentum in the air and clips of me running up and off the walls. I think these mechanics on the wall run tends to slow the game down a little bit, and it doesn't always work. Again, I have no idea how the devs wanted me to not get shocked on that platforming challenge. The timing seemed incorrect. So sometimes these platforming puzzles don't exactly flow properly, or at least they're counterintuitive. Another little nitpick, at least on this level, would be sort of the gimmicky mechanic of these covered walls where you can't quite see where the exits are. It just slows down play and doesn't really provide much of a challenge. It's not particularly perilous, even with the falling platforms. We'll move on to a mini-boss here, which, again, while fun to beat on, is kind of trivialized. You'll see that it does the exact same pattern every cycle, which is throwing those bombs. So as long as you're not right up in its face, you're not going to have any problems or ever get hit. You'll also notice on the top my health bar in the New Game Plus slowly degrades, and I get health back as I hit enemies, which adds to the challenge and is pretty nice to keep things moving. Another good example of how they progress the dash mechanic through the level. And right here, what do? Cannonball. Well, I have to attack it. They literally don't let you jump out of the way, which teaches you that the cannonballs are not just environmental hazards, but can be used, slashed and manipulated. So that ladder is a really nice iteration on that. Feels really good to the player. I'll resist talking about the sound design there. But otherwise, a really fun way to implement some movement options into the level and to clear hazards. Now we're going to move on to the boss, which I have a multitude of issues with in this sort of game. Very little reaction time on that startup there. A lot of players get hit immediately because he starts lunging at you, and Propeller Knight, the name of the boss, is a little bit of a pretty princess in that regard. And then right here we have my biggest issue with the campaign in general. If you see that little curio goblin guy that I threw out, he just basically shredded the entire boss's health bar, and it trivializes the boss fights, and I have no idea why they made a Curio so unbelievably overpowered. Big mistake, I think, on Yacht Club Games' part. I realize that this is a New Game Plus playthrough, but you should not be able to beat a boss in literally 15 seconds. But otherwise, an excellent game. Has some balance issues in those regards, but the platforming is pretty smooth. Not every level is perfect, but otherwise still a pretty good experience overall. Next, we are moving on to Game Dev Tycoon, a simulator where you create your own video games and create your own gaming empire. The main core gameplay revolves around developing games and picking genre, platform, and features. As you develop the game, you adjust certain sliders like sound design versus graphics or world design versus dialogues in order to maximize the points and score you get whenever building a game. So as soon as you know how to set the sliders, the gameplay value falls. Now, admittedly, there are many combinations. There's several genres: action, adventure, simulation, etc., that all have different optimal paths and genres and sliders to set. So, for example, with this one, you'll see that my previous knowledge actually literally indicates what is best to emphasize, which you find out through research in the game. And that will result in a higher design and tech score. That in and of itself isn't a bad thing. There's not much replayability value in it inherently, but it's not bad. The problem that I had is when I was looking through the game's mechanics and found out that the rating system was based on your personal bests. So if you blew it out of the water and got a 10 out of 10 game and did extremely well, in order to get your next 10 out of 10 game that would sell very well, you would have to do better than that tech score. It's not dependent on the market. It's not dependent on any sort of like progression over time. It's literally just your own personal score set, which means the optimal way to play the game is to get the minimum score required to get a hit, so that it will be easier the next time to get another hit. So in that sense, that's not a very compelling way to optimize, because the game actively punishes you for making optimal choices, because if you do extremely well with one game, you'll have to do even better than that the next time. So a good game isn't a good game anymore. It's all relative to what you're doing. And once I found that out, it basically shattered my suspension of disbelief and killed the game for me completely. There are a lot of genres, there are a lot of options and sliders, which do make it interesting. The market changes. There isn't really much adaptation you have to do. You can just sort of make the same games over and over again and still be relatively successful. But otherwise, the game has a replayability problem and can be fun in a novel sense. But again, that scoring system absolutely cripples the experience in the end. Next up is Fury, a third-person, top-down, basically boss rush game with the basis of a parry mechanic. As you'll see, I have to have these timings to deflect this gentleman's attacks. This game is centered around boss fights and boss fights only. They all have phases. As you can see with the squares, that indicates the amount of phases that you have. You can heal by parrying correctly, and you have 3 chances, basically, to get through a phase, or else you'll fall. If you beat a phase, then you get a sort of another life back, quote-unquote, or else you have to start the entire fight over again. As you'll see, I am terrible at parrying and just got knocked down. But this fight in particular forces you to have really good parry timing and use your dash mechanic to stay out of areas that are particularly dangerous and going to deal a lot of damage to you. The game isn't tolerant of many hits, but the game is fast-paced. There are some more advanced ways in order to control the pacing of the fight versus the boss controlling how you have to respond to him, but frankly I'm not skilled enough to deploy on those, so I'll have to judge the game from a more casual standpoint. The cycles tend to introduce one new mechanic at a time. On the first phase, you'd see that he wasn't doing that AoE attack. but mainly it's just a memorization sort of timing thing, with not a lot of skill in that regard once you learn the rhythm. But overall, the timings are tough enough that it provides a novel challenge every time that you're approached. As we get into this last phase, you're going to see that the entire perspective has been changed. Into the second phase of the fight, keeping the player on their toes. Instead of it being a top-down environment, it's sort of been turned into a 2D where you can only move horizontally and have to contend with this melee bruiser a lot more directly. Again, timing-based and all about parry mechanics. Every parry is mixed up. The phases tend to be on the shorter side, as you can see that I just beat him in a matter of about 15 seconds. In the last phase, the boss basically gets total control over the pacing of the fight. There's not really much that you can do in that regard, and that tends to be that way in all of the Fury fights, and it's more about maybe the spectacle. This one is an exception in that it isn't as much as an insane spectacle as the others. But overall, it has a tendency to be pretty fun. I don't necessarily agree with the way that some of the attacks are based out. If you notice when he throws those waves out like this, I have a very, very difficult time dodging them because he throws too many out and you run out of room. So some of the attacks tend to be unfair, but I do think that the devs have tried their best to make this game as fair as possible for the complexity that a boss rush game like this has to demand of its player in order to keep it interesting. The phases are short, and once you learn them, they sort of start to seem trivial. As you'll see, I beat what I believe is his name, the Wave, pretty quickly, and even though I made a mistake, I still get to beat him. So, overall, Fury, very good game. Sometimes the mechanics are a little bit lame, and maybe I'm just salty about it because I'm bad and got a D. And last up, we have Crypt of the Necrodancer, which I'm going to consider a rhythm game. Yes, it's top-down, but the genre's rhythm game. So it counts. I can use Gungeon and Crypt. In this game, you get to move in any 4 direction, and you have to do so on beat. Otherwise, you don't move. Monsters move on beat as well to the song playing in the background, which hopefully you can hear. The player moves through 3 floors and then fights a boss to progress through the story. There are a variety of enemies. As you can see right there, that one just confused me, which because I stood a certain tile away, it reversed my controls. And there are different items. I picked up a frost charm that froze all the enemies when I got hit. So it let me completely trivialize the room. If you want to talk about balance issues, that would be one of them. Also, you tend to have a very large health pool, for the default story anyways. There's shops, and enemies drop gold. If you stay on rhythm, you get more gold. You can buy more items. That can result in you getting a bit overpowered, but considering the difficulty of the game and the rarity of health, it's necessary. Each floor has a mini-boss, which has a different mechanic. This one, actually, once you hit it, will make you deaf to the music. Of course, that doesn't really matter when, like I said, the RNG allows you to do so much damage that you can just sort of face tank everything that you run into. That's one of the problems Crypt has, but other than that, most of the time you have to learn the enemy patterns in order to fight them and survive. Boss fights are another big meaty part, and this would be one of the more interesting encounters, which would be the final boss of the game, in which you control 2 characters rather than 1, and they move in the same, and you have to manipulate them using the walls in order to hit these little buttons to progress the fight. Once you get into the final phase, things get a little bit more climactic, and you have to walk Cadence, which is the one with the yellow hair, near the Necrodancer while he's spawning tons of monsters that you have to deal with. If either of your characters die, then you lose, and it sends you all the way back to the start on the first floor. So, again, another roguelike pattern. Overall, this game works very, very well. But the same thing with Gungeon in terms of RNG allows the characters to get into a very, very overpowered state. In terms of it being a good puzzle rhythm game, however, I would definitely approve of it.
But why?
Overall, this game does its job. And if you want things to be more difficult, you can play optional characters who will instantly die if you miss a single beat, which either means not hitting the keys or hitting the keys at the wrong time. So, for the sadists out there, Crypt has it all. I hope you enjoyed my little tirade on all of the games that I like and don't like in terms of Game Dev Tycoon anyways. And thank you very much.